Hello and welcome to the GMMP interview series. This is a series of conversations with some of the people involved in the GMMP research project, the Global Media Monitoring Project. My name is Gianni Lunga, and in today's episode I'm joined by a researcher and senior lecturer from the University of Padova in Italy. She's a seminar scholar in gender studies and she has specialized in gender and media policy. And I'm talking about Dr. Claudia Padovani. In case this is your first time listening to the show, I'm going to mention a link that is sort of the hub in a way for all the things related to this show. The link is jo.my/GMMP. So once again, jo.my/GMMP. Make sure to go to that link and you'll be redirected to the webpage that features all of the resources mentioned in today's episode as well as the past episodes and more information about the Global Media Monitoring Project. Okay, are you ready? Great, here is the interview with Dr. Claudia Padovani. Hi and welcome to the GMMP interview series. I'm Gianni Lunga, and in this episode I'm joined by a seminar scholar who works on gender and the relationship between gender, media and media policy. From the University of Padova, Italy, Dr. Claudia Padovani. Dr. Padovani, hello, welcome.
Hi, Jan. It's a pleasure to be with you today.
It's exciting to have you here because we have quite some ground to cover. And I think the first question I should ask you to kick off this conversation has actually to do with your personal interests on the areas you're working in and you do research on. When we think about gender, when we think about media, communication, and policy, what attracted you to those areas in the first place?
The interesting element is that I am not a gender scholar by training. So I come from international relation and political science. That is my background as a PhD. And then I've always been interested in communication and international communication. I also have part of my background in human rights. So many years ago, I think it was around the year 2000, slightly earlier than 2000, I was connected with WAC, the World Association for Christian Communication, that is coordinating the GMMP. And I was liaised with them because they had an interest in communication and as a human right. So that was my way into WAC before GMP. And then at some point, I was invited to take part and actually coordinate the GMMP edition in 2000 for Italy. And that was the very beginning. But it was a very thin entrance, I could say. And interestingly, there was another moment, like exactly 10 years after, again with GMMP, that brought me into a much more intense commitment to issues of gender and media and diversity. And that was the occasion of the IAMCR International Conference in Portugal in 2010. Another edition of GMMP had just taken place. And together with Karen Ross, who was a colleague at the time, but not really somebody I knew very well, we decided to organize together a panel at the conference, bringing together as many GMMP coordinators as possible in Braga, in Portugal. And starting from that occasion, which was exciting because a number of us were there just sharing the experience, then Karen and we started collaborating on several projects, including for the European Institute for Gender Equality, and then later on the AGEMI that we may speak a little bit about afterwards.
Thank you so much. It was interesting to listen to your journey, if I can use that term, and as you said, how you made this thin entrance into that space, and now how you are one of the actors, of the agents that is heavily involved in that space. And I'm curious, obviously, if we think about the intersection between media, between communication and gender representation, it's quite under-researched. I think it's fair to say that. But in your opinion, why does policy matter and why it's something that can't be ignored when it comes to scholars, when it comes even to activists, perhaps?
think it's relevant that we're finally focusing on the policy dimension of the complex interconnection between gender and media and communication. Because if we go back to the Beijing conference in 1995, we all know that at the time, Section J was adopted, which meant a full area among the critical areas focusing precisely on women at the media back then. And interestingly, there was at the time a focus both on representational aspect as well as participation of women in the media, in the news, in their career, and also in decision making. What is less known is that in Section J, part of the recommendations were actually directly focused on the need to adopt policy. And so there was this mention from the very beginning of the, let's say, time that we all refer to as, an important starting point for dealing with gender and media. So at the time, Section J was referring to both national media policies that were to include reference to gender mainstreaming and to gender issues, and also an invitation to the media organization to adopt policies and codes, self-regulatory mechanism. So what has been interesting to me was precisely to realize that not much has been done in practice to respond to those recommendations, but also that most of the scholarly community have not been very interested in this. And this is maybe because major focus has been over the years, of course, on issues of representation, the image, the portrayal. So that is certainly the majority, the bigger part of scholarly work in relation to gender and media. Mm-hmm. Then, of course, a number of studies have been conducted in terms of how women live, experience their professional work inside the media, the news media, and also the audiovisual sector more broadly in general. So issues that pertain to the media as well as to other sectors, like so-called glass ceilings and difficulties for women to access managerial roles and powerful position, that has been investigated for the media. But some of the structural elements, and I think I relate policy also to what is more of an intervention that requires a very strong political will, that requires a full acknowledgement of the fact that it is about, there is a need to establish clear principles and also goals. Mm-hmm. So be it at the national level when a country is developing their own national media policy, or at the level of the organization where maybe self-regulatory mechanisms are defined. It's not just about fixing the principles of equality and non-discrimination, the importance of diversity, plural voices. It's also about establishing some mechanisms according to which these principles can be implemented and then monitored. Because what we have seen from our analysis, and I'm here referring to analysis that we have conducted over the last 10 years in the European context, but also elsewhere, is that we do find instances when media organizations, for instance, they adopt policies, but it's much more likely that they adopt very general provisions establishing the core principles or the basic rights and freedoms. And it's a lot less common to find specific measures like the establishment of training initiative or gender equality departments or ombudsperson to deal with these kind of issues. And so one of the risks is that even when we adopt some policy instruments, there are not adequate mechanisms to make sure that the principles that are enshrined are then brought into the practice. Maybe so one of the reasons why these policies are important are, of course, setting the principle. It's also about identifying possible mechanisms, including sanctions for when the principles are not respected. But what we have seen analyzing some of the processes that have led to the adoption of policy is that developing a debate, organizing and setting up a debate And when it is possible, also some kind of public consultation, engaging the public, engaging civil society organization, engaging the media professionals in the debate, like we have seen in Argentina in around 2008 and 9, more recently in Mexico. So some interesting lessons come from the Latin American context. On all those occasions, the broad public debate has meant also a transformation of the general public awareness that these issues are important. And therefore, the public is now expecting the media to behave according to their principle. So it is not just the formality of the policy that I think we should keep in mind, but it's the entire process that comes before the policy and that can be implemented after the policy has been adopted.
Thank you. You made some very interesting points. You unpacked a couple of different topics, aspects to think about. And what I'm about to ask you could be the topic for an entire conversation or even for a series of conversations or interviews. But if we think about some of the things you just talked about, and if we think about them in the global context, so not necessarily only from a European standpoint, but really from a global standpoint, what would you say if you were to list a few of the key issues or the key challenges when it comes to media, when it comes to gender, when it comes to policy? You already touched upon some of them a little bit, but are there some you want to highlight, or perhaps some that we haven't touched upon yet during this conversation that you would like to put emphasis on?
Of course, as you say, the issues are complex and they're very much interconnected. So there are several aspects that we could talk about. But maybe just to highlight some of the things that I think today we should keep in mind is that on the one side, we're still witnessing, after so many years and actually after decades, the persistence of a number of problematic elements, discriminatory practices. So both in relation to representation and portrayal, and in relation to women's participation in the media, many of the old issues are still there with us. What we know from GMMP and a number of other studies is that actually there has been some progress. But all these studies, they also highlight how the progress has been very slow, and it would take many, many years to come to a situation where we can actually talk about equality. So this long trajectory of unequal practices and experiences, which then touch upon the life of women and men, but particularly women. So it's not just the profession, but it's how these inequalities may impact on your personal self-esteem, on your possibility to organize a family, to have projects for your life, and then how you perform within your profession. So all these issues, of course, are still there with us. In that respect, so in respect to these kind of old issue, I think there is an interesting document, actually an interesting initiative that was carried out last year by the EBU, the European Broadcasting Union, kind of a federation of all public service broadcasters, not only from the European countries, but also from other 56 countries altogether. They have conducted a study precisely to track not so much issues of representation, so on-screen women, but rather off-screen. So everything that has to do with the practice, the careers, the possibility to express women and men's talents in the media. And I think it's interesting that they highlight so much the slow progress, but at the same time, the fact that over the last few years, public sector's media have done a lot more to actually improve the situation. So much so that nowadays, at least within the countries covered by EBU study, 44% of women are working in the sector. And it's interesting to see how over the last 3-4 years, in the public service media, more women have been able to make it to higher position in the hierarchy. So gaining some power finally in managerial position, more than in the private sector. And there, the data are quite striking, because of course we're not talking about parity. We're still walking along that path, but having like 27% women in top level position in the public service versus 9% in the private sector for the audiovisual media, I think this is something that's telling how at least some of the gender equality principles have been adopted by the public service, and maybe there is a wider recognition that this is relevant. So we have problematic issues with us nowadays, but also some of these developments that needs to be recognized. On the other side, I think there are some issues that are coming to light and gaining much space in the areas where we study, but also in the activities of different international organizations, because these are of concern at a global level, and that has a lot to do with the diffusion of digital technologies, the social media, and some of the implications that these are having, particularly for women working in the media sector, particularly not only the media sector, all public figures, but there are a number of studies that are really highlighting how instances of abuse and harassment, aggressive, violent positions and activities are being carried out against women who speak their voice, who are autonomous in expressing their positions and interests in society. So that is one of the most concerning issue. So much so that the United Nations Rapporteur for Freedom of Expression has focused into this. The OECD has worked into this. Of course, International Federation of Journalists. So there is a whole thread of analysis, investigation, and data collection that are constantly highlighting the fact that this is becoming a major issue for the women in the sector.
It's very interesting to listen to what you're saying, but also a bit sad to think about some of the numbers you shared with us. For example, the 9% in the private sector and the 29%, anyways, about 3 times more in the public sector. And you talked about the long trajectory, and I'm curious, obviously, this is a complex issue and it can't just be simplified and resolved in an interview or a conversation like we are having now. But having said that, are there some phenomenons, some policies, some actions that you think that if they were taken, if they were carried out, could potentially speed up the process or make the trajectory shorter? Anything comes to mind?
Of course, the long trajectory is a trajectory of data collection, studies, and analysis. But alongside, for all these years, we've also witnessed, recommendations, list of things to do, things that could be done to improve the situation. Again, starting from the Beijing section J, because a number of recommendations were made in that context, addressing responsibility of different actors. So one thing that I think should be highlighted is the fact that in the attempt, in the effort to overcome these persisting inequalities, there is a lot to be done, and the responsibility is with different agents. Of course, international organizations have a role to play, national governments have a role to play. We're speaking here as scholars and educators, so of course there is a major role to be played by those institutions that are training the next generation of journalists, both women and men. So universities and vocational training as well. And when we talk about training is also something that happens and should be actually carried out within the media themselves to allow and help professionals develop their own understanding, their own competencies. So it's interesting to see that, for instance, in Italy, where we've not been identified as a model on these issues for many years, but in more recent years, there are efforts being done, particularly by women journalist associations. There is an association called Julia, that collects more than 600 professional women from around the country, and they organize training which are recognized by the Order of Journalists. So there are formal trainings that are offered on different aspects of gender equality, with a particular focus recently on the language through which we report gender-based violence, for instance. So again, we're talking about the content. How are we reporting issues that relate particularly to women experience? There is a major effort to work in that direction. So what I'm saying here is that there is no simple solution. Mm-hmm. There is no one single solution. And there are different efforts, different interventions to be made at different levels, depending on the responsibility of these actors that I have mentioned. Interestingly, if I go back to the activities of EBU that I was mentioning before, what EBU has done was to carry out a study throughout the different member countries. But then they also elaborated a quite long document. It's about 60 pages of recommendations from the perspective of the public sector media on what could be done. And interestingly, there are at least 4 points that they highlight. So I can take those because I think they're valuable for us to maybe keep in mind and reflect upon a bit more. One is we constantly need to have updated data. So having the data, having the numbers, understanding these diversities that we were talking about, I think that remains crucial because that is a reflection of the reality that we're facing. So even tracing progress cannot be done unless we are basing or we're grounding our activities on a complete and consistent knowledge of the reality. The second element is this is not an issue for women. It's not an issue for women in leadership. It's not an issue for just some of those who are working in the sector. Because what is required is a cultural transformation. It needs to involve and engage all those who are working in the sector. So men and women trying to find ways to collaborate, to share to spread the word, to increase the awareness. So thinking of transforming gender equality is about the entire sector, and it requires a commitment from all those who are involved. Coming back to the cultural element, which is a third element that is actually mentioned, again, training and having opportunities and occasions to reflect about the data that are collected within the newsroom, for instance. Mm-hmm. So if I look at some of the Scandinavian countries, Sweden in particular, but also Finland, we know that there are practices within the newsroom where this data collection and monitoring is done on a regular basis, even daily, even weekly. What I think is relevant there is not just the fact that some monitoring is done, but the process that the monitoring sets in place. And the fact that those data become the elements upon which a conversation starts within the newsroom or within the media, and therefore the issues are addressed, there's better understanding of where the gaps are, where the difficulties are, what can be the alternative solutions, not as decided by somebody at the top or somebody outside of the sector, but decided by those who are directly involved in the daily routines that we know are demanding, and they're very fast and challenging in that respect. So that is the third element, the cultural. And of course, the fourth is the policy. I remain strongly convinced that having a policy in place that becomes something for everybody from within the sector to recognize, to appreciate. It remains as a pillar for those who are struggling in order to have their equal rights recognized. It remains as a fundamental ground. So one of the pillars for us to make change, in my view, still remains policy adoption.
Thank you very much for sharing your thoughts. A lot to think about, and as you said, it's really a complex topic. It's a multi-layer topic. It's a multi-stakeholder topic, and it was interesting to really listen to the four pillars you were talking about. And I think each and every one could and should be studied deeply or more in depth, and then obviously all of them together combined to get the bigger picture, if I can use that term. Now I would like to ask you a question related to a recent book by Nordicom that you have contributed to, and I gonna actually mention the book. And we have mentioned a few different things. We have mentioned a few organizations. I'm about to mention the book, which is actually titled Comparing Gender and Media Equality Across the Globe, a cross-national study of the qualities, causes, and consequences of gender equality in and through the news media, as I said, by Nordicom. I'll make sure to add the links to everything we're covering here in the show notes page, which is a web page that goes along with this conversation. So if you want to go back to some of the organization that Dr. Padovani mentioned, or you want to look at the book I just mentioned, the show notes page that goes along with this recording, it's the way to go. So my question for you is, I know you have contributed to the book with a chapter, and when it comes to, a chapter on gender policies, and when it comes to the chapter itself, are there a couple of findings that you would like to cover here on the show, in this conversation? Anything in particular that comes to mind that perhaps it's connected to some of the points we have just touched upon?
Well, as you noticed, this is a book with a very long title. It's the result of a very ambitious project. So I'm not going into the detail and the complexities of that, but of course it has just come out from Nordicom. It's open access, so it can be downloaded and read and analyzed by everybody. It was a precious opportunity for me to collaborate with the group, with Monica Dierf-Pierre and Maria Edstrom, who are the editors, and also with other expert scholars who have also contributed. And as you said, my contribution in that collection is a chapter that I wrote with an Italian colleague, Rossella Bozzon. And we have been using the data set that was created and resulted from a project by the International Women's Media Foundation that was coordinated by my colleague and good friend, Caroline Byerly, looking at 59 countries. And the very specific element that we took into consideration were precisely which media organizations in those 59 countries had adopted any kind of policy that relate to gender equality, because we know that there can be several. So when we speak about policy, first of all, it's kind of a complex term. Policy is not the same as a legal instrument, is not the same as maybe just talking about measures, right? So in the chapter, we make this effort of exploring a bit more, even in theoretical terms, what can we think of as policy. And the approach that we take was inspired by feminist scholar Carol Bacchi, who said it is not the policy that identify solutions for the problem, but it's actually the policy that creates the problem. The approach that she proposes is called what's the problem represented to be. It's known as what's the problem represented to be, because what she says is the way any issue is framed in a policy document, so in the vocabulary and the language of a policy, is also a way of defining the problem and framing it. And on the basis of this framing, we can derive a certain understanding of the problem and then also the solutions to be proposed to the problem. So the chapter takes this kind of approach, and then we look at different types of gender-related policies that can be adopted by media organization. So we're talking about the kind of measures, codes, they can be called policies sometimes. In some cases, they are very general, basic principles for gender equality. In other cases, they can relate to maternal leave. These are very diffused. These are maybe the policies that we can find the most across all regions from around the world. They can be specific on harassment, for instance, so combating harassment against women. But they can also be more focused. So they could be, policies that support work-life balance. So supporting women to take part in their profession and to work at the same time having kind of support in their personal life, or sharing the burden of personal commitment between women and men. So the idea was the more media organizations are committed and the broader understanding they have of the complex issues that relate to gender equality, the more they are likely to adopt different policies. So there is nothing that prevents any media organization from adopting more than one, so a general policy and then more specific. But what we notice around the world is that in some cases, actually, there are media companies that have done so, and they have adopted more of these kind of policies. And in that respect, we have developed the analysis, thinking in terms of the kind of regime that the resulting situation is producing in terms of the practices, discourses, and also the principle that support gender equality and gender mainstreaming in that context. Now, the chapter is a lot more complicated, but this was one of the instances. So thinking in terms of how the problem is issued, so what kind of understanding of gender equality in and through the media do the media around the world have? So on the one side, we have some countries where we see this plural adoption. Some of these are in the Scandinavian countries, so Sweden and Finland, also Australia, New Zealand, also South Korea or Israel. But on the other side, we also have a cluster of countries that we have defined as gender blind. So basically countries where the maximum that we find is something about maternity leave, which is maybe required by the law, and there is nothing else. So, and between these two poles of a full understanding or comprehensive understanding of issue and kind of blindness to the gender equality issue, we have a variety of intermediate positions. So I certainly invite anybody who's interested to read this. Maybe something that I could also mention as a way of stimulating the readership is what we were really trying to do with this chapter was not only to focus on how media organizations perform as far as their adoption, but try to understand if all this variety that I have just described, so very different situation across different countries, could be explained on the basis of contextual variables. So should we expect to have more policy adopted by media organizations if the country has more presence of women in public and institutions? So if there is a broader political representation of women, or if the socioeconomic conditions are different, or are we more likely to find these kind of policies if a country has a very lively feminist or civil society organization with a gender focus. So the whole analysis was trying to develop an understanding of why, first of all, policies are seldom adopted. So the baseline is that these are not enough. And then secondly, looking at the variety, try to explain that variety. So as you can tell, it's quite articulated, but I hope by reading the chapter, you can get a full picture of some of the findings.
Thank you very much, Dr. Padovani, for taking a couple of minutes and tell us more about the chapter. As I said early on, just a reminder, I'm going to add the link to that in the show notes page. So if you want to read the chapter or you want to explore the entire book, you're going to find it in an easy place. So the show notes page, which is, as I said, a web page that goes along with this conversation. Now, I have two final questions for you before we wrap things up. The first one has to do with your involvement. Earlier, you mentioned different stakeholders, different agents, and I know that you have been involved in quite many different international endeavors, international projects, networks. I want to mention a couple of them. Obviously, we have the GMMP, the Global Media Monitoring Project. We have, I think it's pronounced Agemi, which is an online knowledge platform that focuses on promoting a more equal, diverse, and inclusive media. We have the UniTwin, which is the UNESCO's program that promotes international cooperation and networking between universities. And then another one that we have is the GAMAG or GAMAG, the Global Alliance on Media and Gender. So when we think about your involvement in these endeavors, networks, organizations, and others, what can you tell us in terms of the GMMP? How is it linked to some of the ones I mentioned, for example, in its activities? So the Global Media Monitoring Project, how is it connected to some of the initiatives and projects and researches that you've been involved in?
This is easy question. It's not short, but it's easy because the first thing I can say is that GMMP really is a reference point for all these initiatives for a number of reasons that I can try to explain. Also because of the fact that so many of the people, women, but also men, scholars, researchers, advocates, professionals who are involved in these initiatives that you have just mentioned, somehow they have been in touch with GMMP, either because they have participated or, like in my case, we have coordinated because we have used the data coming from GMMP to do advocacy at the national level, or we have taken GMMP to the global level to show that institutions like the United Nations Commission on the Status of Women had to take these issues into consideration. Mm-hmm. Now, the real answer is I think I have been very lucky to witness over the last 10 years, and in particular over the last 5 or 6 years, the emergence of all these networks and all these initiatives. They are different in nature, they're different in focus, and somehow different in the constituencies also. So just to mention a couple of them, the Global Alliance for Media and Gender was initially established somehow in a connection with UNESCO, but it is an autonomous kind of network that brings together over 800 researchers, professionals, media unions from across the world. Mm-hmm. And its focus is very much on advocacy. So to keep these issues high on the agenda as the international community is moving on into new agendas like the Sustainable Development Goals or generation equality. So I think the role that we are playing as GAMAG really is a focus on all the legacy that comes from the previous work that has been done, all the lessons that we have learned, they should not go lost. And the understanding is something that can certainly inform future and upcoming decisions and future documents and future positions that are taken in a context that is clearly much diversified because of digital technologies and global complexities. So some of these initiatives are more focused on advocacy. Others, I can think of academic associations like the IAMCR, the European Consortium for Communication Research, other similar associations in other regions and countries. Of course, we work on research. So we develop new knowledge, new understanding, we provide new data, we try to connect the data and get better sense of where we're heading. And then, of course, there is education and teaching that I have already mentioned. So some of these initiatives, and in particular, the UniTwin Network on Gender, Media and ICT, that is related to a UNESCO program, and the AGEMI, Advancing Gender Equality in Media Industries, which is a platform with a number of resources. Mm-hmm. These are specifically targeted at training a next generation of professionals with a gender-aware, diversity-aware, inclusive kind of understanding and approach. And we're already beginning to witness some of the results. So what I'm saying is different initiatives that some in some part involve the same people. So people like myself who are actually dividing their energies and their time across different things that can be done. But this is possible because there is lots of common ground, common understanding, shared concerns. And I think that much of this comes precisely from the fact that the GMMP has been the reference point, as I said at the beginning, for such a long time. So, of course, GMMP has a specific focus on the news, on representation. It does not touch upon all the complexities of gender media issues, but it has provided really kind of a common base upon which many of us have then developed further, understanding specific research activities and different scenarios. So kind of a bonding together. I think GMMP, among the different functions it has had, it also bears the responsibility of having supported the emergence and the life of these transnational networks.
Thank you very much for taking the time and telling us a little bit more about the different projects and how they intertwine in a way with the GMMP. And the final question I have for you, it's kind of twofold. That on the one hand, I would like to ask you if there is anything you would like to emphasize, perhaps something that we didn't have time to cover, that it's related to some of the topics we have discussed in this conversation. So that's the first part of the question. And the second part is if there is somebody, for example, a student who's thinking about getting involved in some of these projects, in some of the media activism, he or she is interested in becoming involved, what would you tell them? Do you have any recommendations, anything they should consider?
I think I would like to start from the last question, thinking about my own students. Students who are this very afternoon to take their final exam in a course where, of course, we have been dealing with these issues, and I think of, their ideas and some very often the surprise when they discover that these are the data, that these are the degree of the issue. So thinking about young people and younger colleagues who are entering the space, first of all, I think we need to be grateful for the wealth of data, knowledge, resources that have been elaborated over time and are now available. So it's a very rich context. Then, as we said, some issues are maybe less common, less part of the mainstream when we talk about gender and media, but there is very much that can be explored. So maybe it's not really a recommendation, but it's a warning for anybody who is entering the space to be aware of that richness and also of the challenges, because navigating through all this, it's not easy. But I guess my point here is never stop at only, you can have different entry points to gender and media issues. So of course, representation, fair, unfair, balanced, unbalanced, that remains an issue. Through images, through wording, through the use of vocabulary. So the language, for instance, particularly in Latin countries like us, but in many other countries, those are all relevant elements that should not be left aside. Then, of course, you have all the issues that pertain to the profession, to accessing the profession, to the life of talents within a specific sector, which is, of course, it's about communicating to the world, but it's also an economic sector. So it may be working according to different logics that have very little to do with non-discrimination and pluralism. So what I think is many opportunities, many entry points to the analysis, finding the ways to navigate and keep yourself with the tools that allow to make sense of all this complexity. I think that's quite crucial. And of course, in order to do so, I think there are maybe 2-3 points that I would like to make as far as acquiring the tools that may be useful. So my first point would be historical awareness. I think there is still very much a strong tendency because everything is just around us, things are happening. We're provided every other week with new data, with a new study. But of course, there is a long history of exploration, recognition of the issues at stake, a long history of institutional commitment. So I've been mentioning Beijing, but of course, if we take this longer approach, we should go back at least to the first World Conference on Women in Mexico in 1975. So be aware of those instances and also the struggles, feminist struggles, societal struggles that have accompanied all this. And of course, all the reports and the studies and the analysis that have been done. I think it's quite crucial because, as I said, many old issues are still with us, but they have a history. And some of the newer issues, I think they can be better understood if there is a historical awareness of what is actually building up in today's terms. The other thing I think is try, even if each of us, we have our own interests and preferences. So of course, we keep the focus. But it's crucial to keep in mind that whatever we decide is our entry point and our specific area of investigation, the holistic understanding of how all these issues that we've been talking about, they intersect, how they interplay, I think that's relevant. And alongside with that, the fact that we've been talking about women and men, and of course, gender equality, but we are more and more thinking in terms of gender and diversity. And therefore, we should never think of women as a single category, but we need to always include and consider the different axes of inequalities and different axes of power that are at play. So intersectional approaches to gender and media, I think, are emerging, and these are quite relevant. And then, of course, the last element is a call for more work on policy. So I'd be happy to join forces and collaborate with anybody. As far as your other question, and here I will be very brief. You said anything else that we have not mentioned. I think we've been speaking, of course, about the issues at stake, some of the interesting developments. I think we are facing challenges. And here also we could have a very long list, but maybe a couple of things that I feel like sharing with you today. The first one is like if I take the very focus of policy, which is also the political economy of the media from a gender perspective, something that we've shared with my colleagues who are also part of these other projects and networks, is the fact that we are fully aware that more study, so serious research, should be done on these issues with a global approach and a global perspective. And that, of course, requires kind of resources that we have not been able to pull together up to now. It's financial resources, but it's also human resources, different disciplinary backgrounds that should be brought together. So there's a major open space there for us and younger scholars also, because there is a lot that could be done. And really, we need to take this global overview and global approach when we're studying things. The other challenge I feel, and here I'm speaking also a bit from my personal perspective and experience, there is a lot going on at the international level, all that we have mentioned. There is quite a lot going on in different national contexts. So in the Italian context, for instance, we're witnessing developments, and so in many other countries, including, I mean, if I think of Finland, the project that is called Gender Matters, that was just concluded, I think is a very, very good example of how different stakeholders can come together to address the issues and try to find solutions. So a lot happening at the national level. Maybe what's the challenge is the kind of disconnection that we're still witnessing between these different levels or across different levels. Because on the one side, I think that having full understanding of the potential that comes from the national level in terms of connecting, creating opportunities for sharing the practices, for knowing better, overcoming some of the linguistic difficulties, for instance, there again, it also turns into a matter of resources, but that would be like precious. So there have been attempts to bring together some of this. And for instance, the example of the Agemi project, the platform was precisely created to collect and create a database of good practices from different countries. This is one attempt of linking all these interesting initiatives that are otherwise quite fragmented. But on the other side, all that is happening at the international level needs to find better ways to trickle down and to enter in a dialogue with the national context. So creating really, occasions for conversations. I don't know who is supposed to, be doing that job. What I do see is that many of us scholars, together with some advocates, together with others, there are efforts to go in that direction. Maybe this effort could be certainly strengthened and improved, also through initiatives like yours. I mean, having the voices speak and making calls for things to happen, I'm sure that this can be a precious contribution. So thank you very much.
Thank you for taking the time for being here. I mean, you shared so much, a lot of food for thoughts, which I think it's the perfect way to wrap up this conversation. I want to say, as I just said, thank you, grazie, for being here, for sharing your insights, for bringing up some very valid points, for making us think about certain things, and also for sharing a little bit of awareness for those who may be thinking about being involved or become part of some of the projects we've talked about, or even projects, organizations, endeavors that are yet to be created in this space. So again, from the University of Padova, Italy, Dr. Claudia Padovani, thank you. Okay, we are back in the studio. Once again, a big thank you, grazie, to Dr. Claudia Padovani. During our conversation, we covered a lot of ground and we mentioned many different projects, researches, and organizations. If you'd like to go back to the list of what we talked about, you can do so on the page I mentioned early on. Once again, the link is jo.my/GMMP. And on that page, you're also going to find the previous chapters, the previous episodes of the GMMP interview series. All right, that's it for this episode. Thank you for joining Dr. Claudia Padovani and I for this conversation.